Greetings, comrades, and welcome to the Eastern Border. I'm finally doing what I had promised that I would do a while ago, and I'm going to talk about how my aunt, Ilse, went to Russia to help me out with my article, and to meet some of her relatives. Now, I had to work really hard to sort of anonymize them. I'll just say that my St. Petersburg relatives are distantly related to Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, who's a Russian composer, a famous one, of the late 19th, early 20th century. And that I also have friends in other parts of Russia and family, but here we're talking about St. Petersburg people. And this was quite scary because, as you know, I'm a persona non grata inside of Russia, and my aunt, is my relative. Thankfully, we don't share a surname, so that's pretty nice. But, I still was very worried about her because apparently since the start of the war, there have been at least 3,500 denunciations. I'll get back to the denunciations later, but yeah, you could get reported easily. My aunt went there first and foremost to just meet our relatives, which we hadn't met for a long while, but the timing was specifically chosen because I was writing my article. And then she decided, she's going to go meet our relatives who were worried that it's the war and she wanted to help me with my article. That was all nice, but again, it was quite dangerous. Apparently, there are still quite active tourism buses, at least in one direction, and the communication has not stopped completely. Although the things happening on the border, now that's a bit more different. I don't know exactly how do you get back here, but there are lines, obviously. Lines all over the place. I also have other friends going to Russia now and then occasionally, but none of whom are my direct relatives, and none of whom I'm that worried about, just as I worry about my own family on the other side of this border, which is hurtful sometimes. But they didn't seem to be any pro-war sentiments over there, so that was neat. In fact, that's what the whole story is about how much this whole image of Russia and how the real people interact with all this, that's the whole point here. For starters, currently going from Riga to St. Petersburg will set you back about 70 or so euros for a bus, which is a 12-hour bus ride. No planes happening there. Also, you have to remember that you have to have a visa, which is approximately about 40-50 euros as well. They drive through Pskov here, and apparently sitting on the border, now that's the difficult part. Now, my aunt has divorced, and she had a tourist visa. She was driving with one of those tourism agency sightseeing tours to St. Petersburg, which is the easiest to get into because, well, St. Petersburg is the most touristy city out there. About 5 million people live there. But my aunt said that was one of her biggest worries. Apparently, once you cross the border, at the border stop, and the bus traveled through Pskov, straight to St. Petersburg, it didn't travel through Estonia. Just a tiny little sliver. Thing is, about 20 people were on the bus, and they were all pulled out, and then passports were checked, apparently, and the first difficult situation was answering the private questions, because these questions reminded me about somewhat of how it was like to get into the United States through New York. In Dallas, they're totally okay. Didn't even take my fingerprints. Just asked some easy questions and let me pass through. But when I was visiting New York, yeah, oh boy, that was scary. And that was a lot, because that was about 3.5 hours of pure sitting through. And similar situation apparently happens on the border between Latvia and Russia. My aunt said that first she was called in and asked for the purpose of the trip, as is pretty normal. And she obviously said tourism, well, which was true, because she did some tourism with her relatives. Not like these people need to know what's going through the system and everything, and what else I'm going to call my relatives for. Then the fun part happened. Of course, the usual question about when are you going to go back and check the visa papers. But then my aunt was asked, what's the profession of your husband? My aunt's divorced. So she said she doesn't know. She doesn't know what he's doing. She's a divorced person. She doesn't really care or hasn't spoken to the person for about 20 years at this point. And then the questions continued on. Thankfully, no questions about me or the show, but still pretty bad. Then they asked again about what date is my aunt going to leave Russia. She answers it completely peacefully with chill and everything. No problems. However, they asked her 3 more times. What about her husband that she doesn't know anything about? About what's his profession? Did she leave any money for him when she was like going? No idea. I think they're really vetting out possible people who might, get worried and mess up their stories. But really, if you're just traveling there alone, then apparently, I guess that's because of their anti-LGBTQ sentiments or something. I don't know. Apparently, on the way back, however, that was a bit more difficult because everyone was vetted again. But on the way there, the bus with all the people stood around there for about 2 hours. On the way back, it was about 4 hours. Border controls are pretty difficult and rough here going on. However, Russia itself is, at least in this area, less weird than you might think. Except, well, obviously, the denunciations. As my aunt was entering Russia, she noticed that in the European part, it was more peaceful than people had expected. She said that, at least in St. Petersburg, she didn't notice any pro-war posters, only some fun bet advertisements, and, well, you couldn't really say that the country is at war at all. Apparently, St. Petersburg is especially protected. Even my relatives said that, well, they only have managed to avoid the conscription because of their jobs too, and universities and whatever. But I will not get into details because they might be listening. But apparently, the life in St. Petersburg goes as normal. No one looked at my aunt that weirdly. She had to answer some questions about her accent, but that's because people found it cute. Then again, my aunt looks quite innocent, really, and I highly doubt that she'd be gotten into any huge amounts of trouble because, although that was scary, she is fully fluent in Russian, albeit with a Baltic accent. That's an interesting situation there because we don't normally notice it, but the accent is quite noticeable, and you can really feel it if you go and speak with people who are living in Russia. Ballets are open, whole Armitage thing, the big museum, that's open as well. The people are trying to make sure that the war does not really touch them personally per se. It's all a bit of a mess. Aunt said that she was mostly confused because all the Russian relatives were worried that maybe we have stopped talking to them or that we all now hate them because they don't really watch Russian TV news and propaganda that much. They're intellectuals, intelligentsia. They're not bad people. They have never voted for Putin themselves, but they also don't consider themselves political. I managed to talk to them, and they said that number one thing that they would like is just this war to end. And again, you can't really talk about politics with anyone inside Russia as long as even if you are in public or something, or even if you post somewhere. Everyone's trying to just get by and pretend that this never happened. And St. Petersburg and Moscow, they're in this area where the government is trying actively to suppress any ideas that there would be a war going on so that people don't worry. It's because of the special role there. The special role of these cities in the Russian Federation. People who are dying in the front lines, they're the marginals, the minorities, the people sent from abroad. Meanwhile, in Moscow and St. Petersburg, well, we have anthropologist Alexandra Akhripova. She studies denunciations in Russia, and she categorizes filling them into 3 groups based on their motivations. Material, emotional, and moral gain. Again, it's 3,500 denunciations happening, and according to her, she studies this, most denunciations are written by ordinary citizens seeking emotional gain. Just the same as happened in Soviet era. People who want to harm their adversaries and get law enforcement to resolve personal conflicts. Others really sincerely believe they're upholding correct moral values by filing complaints. This really describes most people in the anonymous Telegram channels. Members of these groups told the iStories, journalists who looked at the data about all these denunciations and said that they write these things out of civic duty and believe they're making the internet in Russia safer and, quote, cleaner, unquote. The anti-tolerant organization channel administrator wrote, quote, "Most often we report content that violates Russian law. We have practically no leverage over other types of content. I write denunciations because it benefits the Russian people and the state." One of the channel's members on this Telegram channel, by the way, remarked that, quote, "I decided to write denunciations mainly because Western society is slowly but surely falling into the abyss of all this LGBTQ plus chaos. I find it unacceptable. I've seen how this infection negatively affects fragile minds that lack critical thinking." Now, I do have to say that people who write denunciations and their own critical thinking, that's another can of worms, but still.
Hi everyone, Annette here. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Eastern Border. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of you who are supporting us on Patreon or via our website. Your financial support is really what keeps this show going, so thank you from the bottom of our heart. If you're not a Patreon and would like to become one, head over to our Patreon page, patreon.com/theeasternborder, or support us via our website, www.theeasternborder.lv. That said, hope you're enjoying this episode and talk to you later. Bye!
At least I was a bit, worried about my relatives there, and still am, because they're super careful not to get caught about their own views and everything. But their views aren't as radical. They feel that the war is bad, any war is bad, being pacifistic in general, but they feel like they can't really do anything about it. Which is fair enough, but still, this is the horrible apathy. Aunt, however, got interesting looks because, again, Baltic accent. However, people in St. Petersburg are so distant from all of this war stuff. They don't want to live in the war. Their desire is just to make sure the war does not affect them and that it goes back to normal. So they were super friendly when they found out that someone from Latvia who speaks Russian and is a tourist went to Russia. So that was interesting. Aunt also went to theater and opera and socialized a lot, went to museums. She really didn't notice anything negative. Although I probably should mention that she quite likely did not really recognize people around her who were quite likely following her movements and what she was doing here. But back to denunciation filers, because again, this is what I'm worried about. See, according to Akhripova, she reads that serial denunciation filers dislike being called informants because of the public criticism it brings. Society generally doesn't look kindly on complainers. Even in kindergarten, children are taught not to tattle, Ilya Utechin explains. And in various subcultures, snitching is seen as something shameful. However, the state encourages it. While laws prohibiting disinformation and discrediting, in air quotes of course, the Russian army came into effect in 2022, denunciations markedly increased in 2023. The number of denunciations directly depends on the authorities' repressive policies. Again, by Utechin, who is a journalist, by the way, for this iStudies organization who published all this. Thing is, according to these iStudies, the authorities create the image of an enemy that the citizens need to hunt down. This enlists the citizens in the enforcement of repressive measures. But it's still a personal decision. Again, I'm reading about all these denunciations and being worried. Meanwhile, over there, again, due to my weird, very distant relation to Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, in the Memorial Museum there, through our relatives, which were invited there, they had a memorial evening, and people had to bring their own baked goods, talk about this stuff, and so they did. Again, tourism is alive. There are no posters out there saying that you should really join the army or something. The trip by my aunt really explained much more to me what's the main reason why all these Z channels, all these Z populists like Girkin and others why they really are so worried that the average Russian just does not care about the war as much. Because although we looked at these denunciations, and even in this area, but it's not there in Moscow. Okay, in Moscow, you could be photoed everywhere, but St. Petersburg, way less cameras than Moscow. Still quite a lot, but nonetheless, Moscow is quite probably among the most surveilled cities on planet Earth. But in St. Petersburg, really didn't seem so. People who write denunciations are, again, looked down upon in the society in general, even still. Because as I was worried, I asked my relatives about this, and they said that, oh yeah, if you write something about something that you see, then that's seen to be a total, vatnik, totally beaten up on the head with all this Z nonsense, and no one likes these people. There are some who do this a lot, but if you're a reasonable person, you wouldn't want to write a denunciation on anyone, but you'd also try not to get your nose out there, which is why it was pretty difficult for me, and we communicated through Telegram because I wanted my aunt to come back home and I wanted them to be kind of calm. One thing that they were not calm about at all is the fact that apparently a council to strengthen the traditional Russian spiritual and moral values apparently will be created in St. Petersburg and will appear soon. That's announced by the city's municipal administration there, which is what people are worried about because no one really knows what these traditional values actually are. And that's an interesting thing because, well, even Россия сегодня, even they, because again, I was reading this to preparation for my next Z analysis situation here, but I was given this article by my relatives, so that counts. The problem is with Россия сегодня, as their journalist writes, quote, "The problem with our traditional values, ladies and gentlemen, is that there is no single concept approved by the state. For some people, it's what we remember from Soviet times. Dad, mom, me, a friendly family. Others are already demanding a ban on the sale of food with delivery because uncles and aunts have lost the most important culinary skill, which undermines the institution of the family. The third have home improvement in their minds. The fourth want to cover their motherland with their breasts, and the fifth are fighting for reasonable, in air quotes, family violence." Well, that is, when I read about traditional values, the author writes here, "I frankly do not understand what exactly they're trying to sell me. Healthy relations between people or something medieval. Moreover, opinion leaders are already competing to see who can come up with the more trashy concepts scaring away young people. Some of them read and want to immigrate to some Afghanistan, where there still could be a bit more freedom than in Russia, because the things that are often proposed by the government are kind of for cavemen." And the journalist's point here, as he finishes, is, quote, "Their opinion leaders write bullshit for the sake of writing bullshit, and then they are surprised that young people don't share all of this, and even speakers close to us fall out of favor across the pond." So, that's the whole point. As I've been told, yeah, the same is in all of museums and everywhere. People in St. Petersburg, you see, they're proud about their cultural traditions, their educational system. The St. Petersburg has always been the cultural capital of Russia, right? And now they're being force-fed these traditional values, taught to remember how it's like to denounce each other. But the message is very dual. There is brutal propaganda coming out from Solovyov and Kiselyov and all these Telegram channels because people do follow the war. However, on a day-to-day basis in Petersburg, you wouldn't notice that there's a war going on at all. So the whole discrepancy, the whole disconnect between what's happening in the TV and what's happening in the actual real life is just huge. Which means that if you were not super pro-Z, patriotic, pro-Putin, as this whole thing was going on and as it started, then you're probably not going to change your opinion, because on the one hand you have Solovyov and all the other propagandists just shouting out how people are just not caring and how Ukro-Nazis must be destroyed, but at the same time people just function as usual, more or less normal. And that's how I would characterize the trip of my aunt as well. It was more or less normal, except, all the checks on the border and everything of that sort. It was scary, for sure. At least it was something that she managed, and I managed to get some good interviews. But again, I really have to vet everything very thoroughly at this point, and you'll read more when the article plops in. But so far, at least, my aunt is safe, brought a bunch of souvenirs and a bunch of information, and mostly she brought the sense that, well, for the majority of the people, the whole idea that they see on propaganda channels and all this stuff, as long as it doesn't really reach themselves or someone that they're close with, they'd rather avoid all this stuff. And no, Soviet's propaganda hasn't promulgated in the masses, at least not in St. Petersburg. However, as I'm told, even with all these shows and tourism activities happening there, and even with me being able to call them, people just feel awkward and stressed, and they're afraid to lose relatives who live in other countries, and they're afraid of persecution themselves. And they try to, do the best that they can to get through this situation. My relatives told me that this is the most horrific thing they've ever seen in their lives. And it's really hard to put this down, how I once again basically received a whole emotional blast in the head. Like I said, for us, this whole war is like 9/11, just continuously going on. The surprising part is the fact that there are many more people who are very much pro-Vata, all these Vatniks and everything, even more so than there are in Russia. Because again, they in Russia have their prices and things that they can compare with the propaganda materials. But a lot of people in the West, they simply do not have this option. And that's it for this smaller episode today. Again, I had to really sit down and rewrite a bunch of material about what can I tell you, what can't I tell you, and I needed to give you a background on this whole denunciation. We're going to be back with the news pretty soon. So far, well, remember, happiness is mandatory, and до свидания, товарищи.
Thank you for listening to the Eastern Border Show. If you have any questions or comments, go to our website, theeasternborder.lv, and leave a comment there. Or email us at theeasternborder@gmail.com. We'll be sure to answer. You can also follow us on social media and contact us there. If you enjoyed this episode, then leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends about us. It really helps us grow the show. And remember, happiness is mandatory.